You are an expert on China and AI, and we're going to talk about that race. Who's winning, what winning even means, whether it even makes sense to talk about the US and China in terms of a race. But I want to just start with a basic question. How is China's current approach to AI different from the American approach?
It's quite different, actually. So in the US, there's a particular focus on AGI, artificial general intelligence. China is running a different kind of race. I would argue they're running multiple races. On the one hand, they are trying to produce better and better AI models. They do want to try to keep pace with their American competitors. But that's not all they're focused on. They're also focused on efficiency, making these models smaller, cheaper to run, easier to deploy. That's one area. Another area they're focused on is diffusion, trying to get AI into the hands of as many users as possible. And part of that strategy involves open source, right? So this involves kind of giving away your models for free. And that allows other people around the world, including in Silicon Valley, to download Chinese models and to also customize them and tweak them based on their own data and to make them work in a way that's more tailored to their own needs. So that's the advantage of open source. And another major area that China's focused on is applications. Specifically, robotics is a huge area of focus, both for the government and for Chinese AI companies. But you don't really hear so much about AGI. You might hear some of the Chinese tech founders talk about this, and they sometimes sound a little similar to their counterparts in the US. But overall, they're much more focused on these sort of nuts and bolts uses and applications of AI in people's daily lives. That's the key priority.
Describe the everyday experience of this strategy to the extent that it makes a difference in how people are living.
Yeah. So in the larger cities in China, you might see autonomous delivery robots dealing with package deliveries, food deliveries. You might see in a restaurant a waiter robot bringing your food. This is not super widespread yet, but it's starting to come about. Hotels, rather than having room service be delivered by a person pushing a cart coming up the elevator, it might be a delivery robot. You have, of course, the self-driving cars. You might even have drone delivery for coffee or food. But it would be a subtle but probably surprising difference to what most Americans experience in terms of their interaction with AI in the physical world.
So let's just pause for context, because you talked about the government versus the Chinese AI companies, right? And I think most viewers and listeners are accustomed to the American situation where you have a set of big companies. They have been extremely lightly regulated by Washington, D.C. And just in the last year, we've started to get into dynamics where the Pentagon especially seems concerned about their national security implications. There's talk about regulation, screening of models, and so on. But basically, it's been a very traditionally American capitalist environment, not a Manhattan Project or anything like that. To what extent is China similar or different just in the relationship between the companies and what is obviously a much more powerful and often repressive state?
The Chinese Communist Party and the various government agencies that they oversee, they're the ones who set the rules. They're the ones who ultimately are shaping the trajectory of China's AI industry. That's sort of the overarching relationship, but that doesn't mean that the Chinese AI labs themselves are just in lockstep following whatever Beijing says. So what you have is sort of a hybrid model in China, if I could characterize it in a single word. And that would be this sort of broader direction and guidance and certainly support from the central government in China as well as local governments on the one hand, but then also trying to create space for competition and innovation from the Chinese AI labs themselves, whether you're talking about, China's equivalent of the big tech like Alibaba or Tencent, the maker of WeChat, the popular super app, or you're talking about China's own AI startups like Z.AI or Moonshot, which have become actually quite popular around the world.
And all of these companies, though, are operating under some basic constraints that don't apply to U.S. companies right now, mostly around chips. So can you describe that the landscape of constraint in China and what it means.
Yeah. So I had mentioned earlier that Chinese AI companies are trying to run different races. One of those was efficiency. And part of that is in response to the constraints that they're under, in particular around compute and chips. So remember, right now, the U.S. has export controls on our most advanced semiconductors made by basically NVIDIA. And we stop those from officially being sold in China. We allow the sale of watered-down versions, but the idea is that we keep the best and the most advanced chips for American AI companies in the United States and for allies and partners. For China, that means that they don't have access to the most cutting-edge AI chips. They have some Chinese domestic alternatives, and this is a big part of the story, right? One of the leading players in this space is Huawei, right? The heavily sanctioned Chinese tech giant that rose first in the telecom space, branched into smartphones, and is now in pretty much every other industry: electric vehicles, clean technology, and certainly now AI and chips. So China's trying to build up their own capacity for developing AI chips on their own, not just designing them, but actually producing them. But the problem is they're just not quite as good as the NVIDIA chips. And without that, it does put a lot of constraints on what they can do. So they're trying to squeeze more out of very limited compute.
Why aren't their chips as good? I know this is a simple-minded question,
Ooh.
but is it just that NVIDIA is so awesome at engineering and China's engineers, even if they have a NVIDIA chip, can't quite get there themselves? Like, talk to me. Yeah. Talk to me like a non-chip specialist.
This is the $5 trillion question, which is currently, I think, roughly the market cap of NVIDIA today. There's a couple different aspects to this. One is actually the chip fabrication, that is producing the chips. Remember, NVIDIA doesn't make their own chips. TSMC in Taiwan, they're the ones that make the chip. NVIDIA, by partnering with TSMC, can combine some of the best design work out there with some of the best production capabilities. For example, ASML, a Dutch company that maybe some people have heard of, it's actually one of the biggest tech companies in Europe now. They make these extremely precise, extremely expensive lithography machines for basically kind of printing chips. And they're the only ones in the world that can make this kind of machine. They sell those to TSMC. TSMC can use that cutting-edge technology combined with their own cutting-edge manufacturing processes and work with NVIDIA to produce these incredible state-of-the-art chips that keep getting better and better.
So just essentially then, when we talk about the U.S. not allowing NVIDIA to sell to China, we're effectively talking about the U.S. cutting China out of just a larger supply chain,
Absolutely.
Right? That runs through Taiwan, through the Netherlands,
That's right.
through all around the world.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's interesting and very helpful. What does China have going for it then in terms of AI build out that the U.S. doesn't have?
Energy is absolutely huge in China. And this is something that if you're thinking about the broader AI stack, that is not just the chips or the models themselves, but deeper down on the layer, energy is perhaps the most important and least talked about. For the U.S., this is a major bottleneck. It's very hard now for data centers to build out the power capacity to power all those chips that they're putting together. In China, interestingly, they've been building out energy at a very rapid pace. Clean energy, solar, wind, batteries, and they're trying to leverage that ongoing energy build-out to feed into their compute build-out, which then feeds into their AI development. And so you see really interesting sort of strategies that the Chinese are taking. For example, they have this effort to try to build data centers out in the western provinces away from the high population urban areas in China. And at first that might not make any sense, right? Don't you want to have your data centers close to where people are actually using them? Don't you want to have that low latency, high response time? And what China's trying to do is they're trying to leverage a lot of their renewable energy resources out in those further off regions. They're also trying to just do sort of good old-fashioned geographical redistribution, concerned always about having these poorer provinces remain poor while the high-tech Shenzhens and Shanghais, speed on ahead. So this is another area where they're trying to leverage some of their strengths to feed into maybe areas where they're weaker.
So then China is, to sort of simplify, imagining a future where they're only a little bit behind the U.S. And actually, say what that means. People talk about, the best Chinese models are 3 months behind the U.S. or 6 months behind the U.S. How far behind are they, and what does that mean in practice?
Overall, I think the consensus is Chinese models are somewhere between 3, 6 to 9 months, depending on the time of year and which was the latest model that just came out. What that means is that when you look at specific benchmarks, specific evaluations for trying to understand how well these perform on, say, math or coding tasks or even sort of new agentic tasks, the Chinese models that are released today are starting to get close to the American models that were released, a couple months back. So that's what that lead time means. But the thing is, it's not just about having the absolute most cutting edge model, because you can have very, very strong models that can do a lot of agentic, useful tasks, like maybe create a whole PowerPoint presentation for you and do all the research and analysis that goes into that, or answer your emails. So there's this strategy, I think, right now in China where they're hoping that it's not just all about having the very best models, that it's about trying to figure out where to make this work and also to build kind of the broader ecosystem for deploying these models, to integrate them into more and more services, like into food delivery or into ride hailing or into, again, much more practical sort of real world applications.